A bank sent its representatives to repossess a 71-year-old farmer's land in Oxfordshire. 3 generations of the same family had broken their backs on that ground. Every person standing in that yard was local, and not one of them moved to do anything about it. Then, somebody they didn't know walked in. Wax jacket. A Range Rover that had clearly lived a hard life. A face nobody in that particular yard had yet registered. By 11 in the morning, the farm was still the family's. People in the village say the stranger was somebody half of Britain would have clocked immediately. Nobody who was actually standing in that yard has ever confirmed it on the record. Nobody needs to. In the version of this story that travels from pub to pub across the Cotswolds, his name is Harold Beckwith. I want to say something plainly before we go a word further. Harold Beckwith is not a name lifted out of any church register or parish deed. It is the name the story has quietly accumulated over the years, the way stories do. A placeholder, used by people in that village, so the real family at the center of it doesn't have to hear their own name spoken aloud every time somebody orders a round and decides to tell it again. Whether that's a kindness or just a form of local discretion, the village itself hasn't entirely agreed on. But you ought to know walking in, what we are dealing with here is living legend. Not sworn testimony, not a court transcript, not a document you could FOIA, a story. And that matters, and we'll come back to why. 68 acres of what farmers around Chipping Norton will tell you is some of the least cooperative ground in England. Cotswold brash, that thin, flinty, almost aggressively stony soil that sits just beneath the surface, across much of the upland limestone country north of Oxford, shallow enough to make a plow argue with every pass, and stubborn enough to break the optimism of a first-generation farmer inside 2 seasons. Mostly barley. A loose handful of sheep that, by the account of anyone who has ever run sheep on difficult arable ground, existed less as a commercial enterprise and more as a habit the farm had developed and nobody had ever formally decided to break. Harold's father had farmed that ground. His father before him had farmed it too. There's a photograph in the telling of this story. Whether it literally hangs in the farmhouse or only in the collective imagination of the village is honestly unclear, showing 3 generations of Beckwith men squinting into the kind of indifferent English sunlight that never quite warms you, standing in front of the same gate that's still there today. The paint peeling off it in roughly the same place it always has. It is not a grand estate. There are no follies, no ornamental lake, no gallery of mounted ancestors staring down from oil paintings. What there has always been, is a farmhouse with a chimney that's needed repointing since at least the Thatcher years, a Dutch barn whose roof has been quietly losing the argument with time for several decades now, and land that has fed the same family through 2 world wars, any number of genuinely terrible harvests, and at least one summer wet enough that the wheat lay down in the mud and simply didn't get back up. But land like that does not survive on family history. It runs on machinery that breaks at 5 in the morning during the worst possible weather. It runs on fertilizer whose price goes up every spring regardless of what the previous harvest brought in. And it runs on whether a bank manager who has never once stood in sleet on frozen ground at dawn and tried to decide whether a field is workable, who nonetheless holds the paperwork that determines whether you get another season to try again. Harold had borrowed against the farm sometime in the 1990s, the way a great many small mixed arable operations did during that period. The cost of a modern combine harvester, even a second-hand one in reasonable working order, had climbed so far beyond what a farm of that size could generate in 2 or 3 seasons that buying one outright without financing was essentially not an option. He borrowed what he needed. He began paying it back the way his father had trained him, methodically, harvest by harvest, a little at a time, the way you approach a debt you fully intend to survive. And then, as it does on small farms across England, with a frequency that the government's rural strategy documents consistently understate, the mechanism stopped. 2 consecutive bad harvests. This is not an unusual sequence in upland Oxfordshire. The county sits in a band of the country where a single shift in summer rainfall patterns can move the difference between a workable crop and a written-off field. Wet summers are not an anomaly in this part of England. They are the recurring threat every arable farmer manages for and occasionally loses to. Harold lost to 2 of them, back to back. The barley that did survive long enough to cut returned a fraction of what the books had projected. What savings had been set aside to absorb one bad year were not enough to absorb two. And somewhere in the middle of that, his wife became seriously ill. Illness does to savings what a wet summer does to standing barley, quietly and completely, and there is nothing left to negotiate with once it's done. The bank's letters changed tone. The ones that said "we understand your position" gave way to ones that said "you are required to." By September, a solicitor's office in Oxford had a date circled on a calendar that meant nothing to anyone who worked in that building, and meant everything to the family it had been assigned to. In the first week of October, a printed notice went up outside the farm gate, cable tied to the same bars 3 generations of Beckwith men had leaned on at the end of long days. The kind of notice that converts a family's life and memory and labor into a line item in a spreadsheet being reviewed by someone who has never met them. Before we go any further, it's worth sitting with that for a moment. Because what happened to Harold Beckwith, whether his name was actually Harold Beckwith or something else entirely, was not an unusual event in rural England in that period. It was, and continues to be, heartbreakingly common. Between 2000 and 2020, the United Kingdom lost in the region of 33,000 farm businesses. Not all of them to bank repossession, some to succession failures, a generation that didn't want to carry on, some to planning nightmares, some simply to the maths of trying to run a small mixed farm in an era of supermarket price pressure and commodity volatility. But a substantial number, particularly among smaller, more heavily mortgaged operations, were lost because a sequence of bad seasons met a debt load that had nowhere left to go. The National Farmers Union has spent the better part of 2 decades trying to make this visible to a public that, by and large, encounters agriculture as the thing that produces the food on the shelf rather than as an industry quietly hollowing itself out in the background. The average age of a farmer in the UK today is somewhere above 59. The number of farms under 20 hectares has dropped by more than a third since the 1980s. The farms that remain are either large enough to absorb the volatility, or they are running on credit and hope in roughly equal measure. The ones in between, the 60 to 100 acre operations that were once the backbone of a particular kind of English rural life, are the ones that have been quietly disappearing. In Oxfordshire specifically, the pressure has an additional layer that most counties don't have to contend with in quite the same way: land values. Agricultural ground in the Cotswolds is among the most expensive in the country, not primarily because it is particularly fertile ground, it often isn't, but because of what it is adjacent to: proximity to Oxford, proximity to the motorway network, and the persistent, rather lucrative possibility that at some point over the next 2 decades, planning permission for some portion of that ground might be granted for residential or commercial development. Farmland bought at agricultural prices and later converted to development land has made more than a few fortunes in this county, which means that when a small farm goes under the hammer here, it does not only attract the people who want to farm it. The village knew the sale was happening, of course. Villages always know. The notice on the gate was almost redundant. By the time it was posted, word had moved through that community in the particular way that bad news moves through a small rural settlement. Not with malice, not as gossip, with the weight of something that affects everyone, even the people whose names aren't on the paperwork. In a place like this, where the surnames in the church register match roughly half the names on the pub quiz team, where your grandfather may well have worked your neighbor's grandfather's harvest in a summer 70 years ago when hands were short, a farm going to auction is not an event. It is a loss, dressed up in the administrative language of a scheduled start time and a printed lot number. By the morning of the auction, the lane up to Hold Farm was carrying more traffic than it was designed for. Mostly Land Rovers and Volvo estates, and 1 or 2 older Defenders that had driven over from neighboring parishes, not because their owners intended to bid on anything, but simply to be present. Hands in pockets, not talking much. The countryside expressing its solidarity in the particular way it sometimes still does, by showing up with no practical power to change anything, and showing up anyway. The vicar's wife had set up a coffee urn on a trestle table by the barn. Nobody had asked her to do it. It had simply appeared, the way these things appear in Oxfordshire, when something genuinely difficult is scheduled to happen on a Tuesday morning. There was shortbread. Nobody ate much of it. Harold came out of his back door wearing a jacket that had been ironed for the occasion. That single detail, in every version of this story I have ever heard told, is the one that lands hardest. a man dressing carefully. For the morning he loses everything. As though good manners were the one thing still entirely within his power to offer. His daughter stood beside him, not holding his hand, not touching him at all, because some grief doesn't want to be held, it only needs company, and she understood that, and she gave him exactly that and nothing more. The auctioneer set up on the tailgate of a Land Rover Defender, because this is the Cotswolds, and even financial ruin arrives here with a certain amount of aesthetic coherence, and read out the lot in the practiced, deliberately flat voice of someone who has done this far too many times already that particular year. With 68 acres, farmhouse, outbuildings, machinery listed separately, he read it the way you read something you've stopped allowing yourself to feel because the weight of feeling it every single time would simply break you. And there, at the very back of the yard, leaning against a gate post with his arms folded, was a man in a wax jacket and wraparound sunglasses who hadn't been introduced to anyone, hadn't announced himself to anyone, and had taken up a position where he could see everything and be registered by no one in particular. Which, if you know anything about the man this story is typically pinned to, is itself a slightly suspicious detail. Restraint has never been the attribute most commonly associated with him. Nobody in the yard had placed him yet. Give it 20 minutes. There is an unwritten convention at farm auctions of this kind, and it is considerably older than anyone standing in that yard. You do not bid against a man on his own land while his family is watching you do it. You do not do it to a neighbor. You do not do it to someone your grandfather knew. It is a rule that has survived entirely without being written down, because violating it would mean you were never welcome in that particular pub again, and in rural England, social memory runs several generations deep and does not offer pardons quickly. So when the auctioneer opened the bidding, the yard did what an English yard full of people who knew Harold Beckwith was going to do. It looked at the ground. It found the middle distance unexpectedly interesting. Nobody local raised a hand. Then someone near the front did. A man in a very good overcoat who was nobody's neighbor and hadn't grown up anywhere near this lane. A man who had driven up from London that morning representing, according to the murmur that went through the yard afterwards, a firm that had been quietly acquiring small Cotswold farms across the preceding year, one at a time, below market value. The kind of acquisition strategy that makes particular sense if you believe, as certain commercial property operators very much do, that agricultural land within commuting distance of Oxford has a planning future worth considerably more than any crop currently growing on it. He offered a number, low, specifically, deliberately, institutionally low. The kind of figure that covers the bank's debt and leaves the family with essentially nothing to show for 4 decades of early starts. The auctioneer paused before repeating it, the small, involuntary hesitation of a decent man about to say something he knows will wound. Harold's daughter's hand found her father's arm, and that was the moment. In the version everybody in the village swears is accurate, though no two people can agree on the precise words, because good stories get worn smooth in the retelling the way river stones do. The man by the gatepost pushed his sunglasses up onto his head and said, in a voice that half the yard instantaneously and simultaneously recognized, "That seems a bit stingy, if I'm honest." The yard went quiet in a very specific way. The coffee urn, by multiple accounts, briefly stopped being poured into anything. "I'm sorry, who are you?" said the auctioneer, not unreasonably. "Just someone who rather likes this bit of countryside," came the reply. "Carry on, I'll bid when it's worth bidding." Now, if you know the reputation of the man this story is generally attached to, and by this point in the morning, most of the people in that yard had worked out who they were looking at, because there is not a very large pool of men in England who simultaneously own a wax jacket in that particular condition, a Range Rover in that particular condition, and a face that recognizable, then what happened next will not surprise you. He did not bid cautiously. He did not bid in the measured, incremental way of a man managing a budget. He bid, by all reports, the way he does most things, with a slightly theatrical enjoyment of watching the other man's face change with every raise of his hand. The London firm's representative countered. The man by the gatepost matched him and raised, without looking at the auctioneer, without any visible concern for the number itself. £10,000 became £15,000. £15,000 became £22,000. Somewhere in the mid-£20,000 above that baseline, the London man's phone rang. He stepped slightly to one side and had a short, tense conversation with someone who was very clearly not authorizing him to go any higher. The whispered urgency of a man trying to get a ceiling raised by someone sitting in an office who cannot see the yard and doesn't understand why the number keeps moving. He folded. The way men in good overcoats fold when the arithmetic has stopped serving the investment thesis and started making a different kind of point instead. The yard had gone entirely quiet. The dog near the barn that had been barking at nothing all morning had stopped too, the way dogs sometimes pick up on a change in the air before the people around them catch it. If you have ever stood in a farmyard, your own, a neighbor's, your grandfather's, at any point in your life, and watched something that genuinely mattered balance on the outcome of a stranger's raised hand, then you already know the particular quality of that silence, that specific held breath. Tell me in the comments where you're watching from today, because I promise you, this story travels considerably further than Oxfordshire ever expected. And while you're there, if this channel is the kind of thing you come back to, please do subscribe, hit the bell, and give this one a like before we reach the end. It helps more than most people realize, and there is a great deal more of Britain's older stories still waiting to be told. Here is where the story, as stories tend to do, gets untidy. And I'll be honest, I rather like that it does. Legend always fractures at the edges where memory meets retelling. Some people say he wrote a check on the spot, on the tailgate of the auctioneer's Defender, using his own knee as a writing surface, the wind trying to take the checkbook the entire time. Some say he insisted the deed go back into Harold's name outright. No strings, no mortgage structure, no lease arrangement with a buyback clause, none of the mechanisms that would have kept him financially involved in the property. Simply handed the farm back to the people it had always belonged to and told the solicitor to sort whatever paperwork was tidiest, as though the legal detail was an inconvenience beneath the level of the principle at stake. And then, and this is the detail that always draws a laugh in the telling, the detail that makes the room relax a little after the tension of the auction itself. Some say he spent a solid 20 minutes going over Harold's ancient, rust-speckled combine harvester with what multiple witnesses described as a level of genuine technical enthusiasm that was somewhat alarming. Peering at the header, asking questions nobody there could properly answer, and eventually asking whether Harold had ever considered growing a barley variety suitable for brewing. That last detail is, whatever else you think about the story, entirely consistent with a man whose own farm roughly 40 miles down the road in Chipping Norton grows precisely that. Which brings us, necessarily, to what we actually know. Because here is the thing. Whatever you conclude about the yard at Hold Farm, whether it happened exactly as told, or whether the story has grown in the retelling to fit a shape the village needed it to fit, there is a man in this county whose real, documented, publicly reported choices over the last several years track so closely to what this legend describes that the legend feels almost understated by comparison. The brewery, built from scratch on the edge of his own farmland outside Chipping Norton, using barley grown within a practical agricultural radius of the site. Not commodity grain sourced from wherever the wholesale markets could price it cheapest that season, locally grown barley, purchased at a price that made sense to the growers, at a time when small arable farmers in this part of Oxfordshire had very little leverage over what they were offered for their output. The farm shop. Stocked deliberately, by policy, by explicit operational choice, with produce sourced within 16 miles of the site, not because it was the most commercially convenient approach, not because the margin on locally sourced product is easier to manage than the margin on nationally distributed supply, but because the man running it decided the geographic constraint was the point, not a problem to be engineered around. The newspaper column he wrote arguing, with more conviction and rather more agricultural detail than most financial columnists typically deploy, that land was a more reliable long-term store of value than most financial instruments, because governments cannot tax the inheritance of it in the same way, and because the price of food, across any timeline long enough to matter, only moves in one direction. The television program, which has now run for long enough and reached an audience substantial enough that a generation of British viewers who had genuinely never thought about where food comes from before have been introduced, through the medium of a man they already trusted and found entertaining, to the realities of running a small agricultural operation in the Cotswolds in the 2020s. The machinery costs, the planning bureaucracy, the weather, the soil, the gap between what a crop costs to grow and what anyone will pay for it. Clarkson's Farm, for those who haven't followed the specific venture, began airing on Amazon Prime Video in 2021 and became, unexpectedly and somewhat gloriously, one of the most watched factual programs about British agriculture ever made. It attracted an audience that farming media had never managed to reach: urban, suburban, largely disconnected from anything involving soil or seasons, and it did so not by being earnest about agriculture, but by being genuinely funny about the difficulty of it, while allowing that difficulty to land for real. The farm itself, diddly squat, sits on just over 1,000 acres of Cotswold brash near Chadlington, bought in 2008 and farmed largely by a man named Kaleb Cooper. Born and bred locally, deeply embedded in the agricultural community of that part of Oxfordshire, while the landowner concentrated on other things. When the regular farm manager retired in 2019, the decision to try managing the operation directly produced a television series, and, somewhat against expectation, a genuine and sustained commitment to making the farm commercially viable in a way that also supported the community around it. The farm shop that became a minor local controversy and a major planning battle with West Oxfordshire District Council is itself a kind of legend now in that part of the county. The queue of cars backing up the lane on summer weekends became, briefly, a national story. The planning restrictions placed on what could be sold from the site and the public argument that followed threw a spotlight on the bureaucratic reality of trying to build any kind of rural enterprise in a designated landscape area in England, which was, in its own way, rather more useful than 100 policy papers had been. But the thing that connects the documented reality of what this man has actually done to the legend of what he supposedly did one morning in a farmyard near Chipping Norton is not the scale of it, it is the instinct behind it. Buying land other people had given up on. Paying local growers fairly when the wholesale market would have allowed him to pay them considerably less and still call the books balanced. Standing in muddy fields in front of cameras and planning committees, and occasionally in print, arguing that an industry most of Britain had quietly stopped paying attention to was worth considerably more than the spreadsheet said. Villages don't invent legends about strangers. They build them around people whose established character already fits the shape of the story. If you have spent enough time listening to what someone actually does, not what they say they do, but what they repeatedly, quietly, at genuine financial risk to themselves, do, then the specific morning may or may not matter. The pattern is real. The legend is just the pattern, concentrated into one dramatic scene. So did it happen? Did a man push his sunglasses up his nose at the back of a farmyard outside Chipping Norton on an October morning and outbid a property developer from London for 68 acres of Cotswold brash? Nobody in the village will produce a receipt. There is no deed in a frame on the farmhouse wall. No photograph of Harold Beckwith standing on his porch holding a piece of paper the way the documented stories have photographs. No record you could subpoena, just a pub. Several witnesses whose accounts share the same broad shape but diverge considerably on the fine points, in the way that trustworthy eyewitness accounts of emotionally significant events almost always do, and a farm that, as best anyone in that community can establish, remains in the Beckwith family's hands today. What we know, what is not legend, what is simply fact, sitting in public accounts and annual reports and interview transcripts, is that the man this story has attached itself to has been doing, quietly and repeatedly, and at real personal cost, precisely the kind of thing this legend imagines him doing in a single cinematic morning. One contract with a local grower at a fair price, one planning fight over a farm shop that shouldn't have needed fighting, one episode of television that made 1 million people who'd never thought about soil in their lives sit forward and start caring about it. Maybe Hold Farm's yard never held that particular morning. Maybe Harold Beckwith is entirely fictional in every sense. Maybe the stranger at the gatepost is a composite the village has assembled from half a dozen different afternoons when somebody local did something decent for a farmer in difficulty, and the face got attached later because it was the face that fit. But somewhere in Oxfordshire, in 100 smaller, quieter, far less dramatic ways, that October morning has been happening for years. One fair price at a time, one guaranteed contract at a time, one season at a time. And that, more than the check written on a knee in the wind, is very probably why the story is still being told. If this is the kind of story that keeps you coming back, then you are exactly the viewer we make this channel for. We tell the stories of British land, of families who held on when it would have been easier to let go, of strangers who showed up when nobody expected them to, and of a countryside that is considerably more complicated and considerably more worth fighting for than most of the national conversation ever quite manages to acknowledge. Subscribe if you haven't already, hit the notification bell so you don't miss wherever we go next, and leave me a comment. Do you think a story has to be entirely true to be entirely worth telling? I'd genuinely like to know where you land on that. Thank you as always for being here. We'll see you in the next one.